The court called her a murderer. Her lawyer called her a victim. The deputy who arrested her called her the most comprehensively failed person he had ever encountered in 14 years of law enforcement. He wrote that in his private notes, never meant for anyone to read. He also wrote something else. He wrote that the man who deserved the prison never spent a single night in one. We are going to talk about Evelyn Hart today, and before this story is over, you are going to have a very strong opinion about which one of those descriptions was closest to the truth. The mountains of eastern Kentucky have a way of swallowing sound. Not the dramatic silence of emptiness, but something denser, more deliberate, as if the hills themselves had decided long ago that certain things were better left unheard. In the autumn of 1924, the coal country around Harlan County wore that silence like a second skin. The forests on the upper slopes had already turned, maple and oak bleeding into amber and rust, and the morning fog settled so thick in the hollows that a man could lose sight of his own boots if he walked too carelessly at dawn. Evelyn Hart had lived on the ridge above Cutter's Creek for 11 years, long enough that most people in the valley below had stopped wondering about her and started simply accepting her, the way they accepted the peculiar lean of a certain pine tree, or the fact that the old Dawson mine shaft always collected standing water, no matter how dry the summer. She was a fact of the landscape, unremarkable in her constancy, remarkable only in her solitude. Her property sat at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen regular use since 1918. The cabin itself was modest, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built from timber that had gone silver grey with age. A kitchen garden ran along the south-facing wall, still holding the last of the autumn collards, and a small smokehouse stood at the edge of the tree line, its darkness fragrant with hickory and salt. From the front porch, on a clear day, you could see 3 counties worth of ridgeline folding, one behind the other, like the pages of a book someone had set aside and never returned to. Evelyn was 42 years old, though she looked neither young nor old in any way that people could easily place. Her hair, dark with threads of grey she had stopped pretending not to notice, was always pulled back from her face in a way that suggested she had no patience for vanity. Her hands were the hands of a woman who worked, rough at the knuckles, precise in their movements. She moved through her days with an economy that some mistook for coldness. Those who bothered to look more carefully might have noticed that her eyes rarely settled, that they were always making small assessments of her surroundings, cataloguing exits and distances in the way that certain animals do when they have learned that stillness is never truly safe. She had come to Cutter's Creek in 1913, arriving by wagon from somewhere nobody ever successfully pinned down, with a single trunk of belongings and enough money to purchase the ridge property outright from a coal company that had already stripped what it wanted from the lower slopes and moved on. She had given her name as Hart, offered nothing further, and the community, practiced in the mountain courtesy of not pressing, had asked nothing further in return. In the years since, she had been a reliable, if distant, presence. She traded eggs and preserves at the general store in Loyal. She paid her taxes on time. She attended no church and no social gathering, but she had twice helped neighbouring families through difficult winters without being asked, leaving provisions on doorsteps before dawn, like a figure from a story, rather than a living woman. On the morning that this story truly begins, though no one present understood it as a beginning, Evelyn was doing nothing more alarming than canning the last of her apple butter. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and hot sugar, steam rising from the water bath on the iron stove, and the early light came through the east window in long, slanted bars that made the whole small room seem like something painted rather than lived in. She worked in silence, her movements unhurried, lifting each jar with practiced care and setting it on the wooden rack to seal. Outside, a pair of jays argued in the hickory tree. The creek below the ridge made its low, continuous sound, more felt than heard. She was reaching for the last jar when she heard the sound of a horse on the logging road. She went still. Not the slow stilling of someone pausing to listen, but the immediate, total stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular sound and recognizes it the instant it arrives. The jar remained in her hand, suspended over the pot, the steam rising around her wrist. She counted the hoofbeats, without being aware that she was counting them. One horse, moving at a walk, unhurried, as if whoever rode it had all the time in the world and wanted her to know it. She set the jar down carefully, without sound, and moved to the window. The logging road was not visible from the kitchen, but she had positioned a small mirror on the outer sill years ago, angled precisely to show a strip of that road through the tree trunks. She had told the one neighbor who had ever noticed it that she used it to watch for deer in the garden. The mirror showed her a horse, a dark bay, with a rider sitting very straight, and for one long moment, she could not make herself look at the rider's face. When she finally did, she felt the warmth of the kitchen leave the room, as completely as if someone had opened all the walls to the November air. The rider stopped at the edge of the property line, where the split rail fence marked the beginning of what was hers. He did not dismount. He simply sat there, looking up at the cabin, and even at that distance there was something in his posture that communicated patience of a very specific and terrible kind. The patience of someone who has nothing to lose by waiting, because they already hold everything that matters. Evelyn turned from the mirror. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were perfectly steady. They had learned, over the years, not to betray her. She picked up the last jar, placed it on the rack, and began wiping down the stove with the methodical care of a woman finishing what she started. But the apple butter had gone cold in her stomach, and the beautiful autumn morning had become something else entirely. A stage set, a held breath, the last ordinary moment before a story she had hoped was finished began again. The man's name, or at least the name he used, was Carver. Whether this was a given name, a surname, or something he had selected for himself, the way a man selects a tool for a particular job, Evelyn had never been entirely certain. She had known him for 9 years, which was long enough to understand that certainty was not something he offered, and that asking for it was a form of weakness he catalogued and kept. He had ridden away that morning without approaching the cabin, without speaking, without any gesture beyond the simple fact of his presence. This was how it always began. Not with demands, not with confrontation, but with the reminder that he knew where she was, that he could find her whenever he chose, that the 11 years she had spent building her silence on this ridge had not made her invisible to him, only to everyone else. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered in the usual way, tucked under the loose stone beside the smokehouse door, where she had once, in what now felt like another woman's lifetime, agreed to leave messages for a man she had believed she could trust. She did not open it immediately. She carried it inside, set it on the table, and made herself eat supper before she touched it again. This was not bravery. This was a ritual she had developed over the years, a way of asserting some small dominance over the fear, of refusing to let urgency collapse her into the kind of person who tears open envelopes with shaking hands. When she finally slit the paper with her kitchen knife, Her face was as composed as if she were reading a seed catalogue. The letter was brief, as his letters always were. He wrote in a cramped, precise hand that suggested someone who had been educated carefully and had later found uses for that education that the educators would not have anticipated. He told her that a man named Elias Pruitt, a coal company land agent out of Middlesbrough, had been asking questions in Loyal, that this man had shown particular interest in properties along the upper ridges, that he had mentioned Evelyn's name in connection with a piece of land that had changed hands under disputed circumstances in the spring of 1922. Then came the line that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. He wrote that he would be happy to ensure Mr. Pruitt's interest in the matter diminished, provided she remained willing to continue their arrangement. The same arrangement that had kept her safe, he reminded her, for the better part of 4 years. Evelyn folded the letter and held it over the oil lamp until it caught, then held it by one corner while it burned down to her fingers, then dropped the last blackened scrap into the ashtray on the mantel. She had burned every letter he had ever sent her. It had never made her feel any cleaner. The arrangement, as he called it, had begun in the winter of 1920. By then, Evelyn had already done the thing that could not be undone. She had not planned it. She had not, as far as she was able to examine herself honestly, been the kind of woman who had such things in her. But a man named Doyle Marsh had come to her door on a February evening, drunk and ugly with it, claiming she owed him money from a land transaction she had refused to complete once she understood what he actually intended to do with the parcel. The argument had moved from the porch to the kitchen. He had put his hands on her. She had taken the cast iron skillet from the hook beside the stove in a movement so fast and instinctive that her mind was several seconds behind her arm. And then she was standing in her own kitchen in the February cold, and Doyle Marsh was on her floor, and the February cold was all there was. Carver had appeared 3 days later, as if summoned, though she had told no one. She had never understood how he knew. She suspected he had been watching her for longer than she realized, that she had been of interest to him before he was of any interest to her. And this thought, when it came to her in sleepless hours, was the one that frightened her most deeply of all. He had offered to help. He had used that word, help, with such careful neutrality, but it took her longer than it should have to understand what he was actually offering, and what it would cost. By the time she understood, she was already past the moment where refusal was a realistic choice. This was, she came to believe, how he operated. He created situations in which the decision had already been made before the person he was managing became aware there was a decision to make. In the 4 years since, 2 other men had come to her door. Not men she had sought, not men she had invited, men who arrived through what appeared to be coincidence, but which she had eventually come to suspect was something Carver arranged deliberately, choosing travellers who had reason to visit the Ridge properties, ensuring they came to her door first, ensuring that her isolation and her fear and her already compromised position did the rest of his work for him. She had never been able to prove this. She was not entirely sure she wanted to. The jays were back in the hickory tree the morning after the letter burned. The creek made its sound. The mountains folded away in every direction, beautiful and indifferent. And Evelyn Hart sat on her porch in the November cold and tried to determine whether the life she was living was one she had chosen or one that had been chosen for her, and found, as she always did, that she could not locate the precise moment where the boundary between those two things had dissolved. Elias Pruitt arrived at the base of the logging road on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, riding a company horse and carrying a leather satchel that he held with the particular care of a man who understood that his documents were more valuable than his person. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a professional pleasantness about him that Evelyn recognized immediately as the kind of pleasantness that has been deliberately cultivated, because the work behind it is not pleasant at all. She had been expecting him, not Pruitt specifically, but someone like him. Carver's letter had been a warning, and warnings from Carver were reliable in the way that weather signs are reliable. Not prophecy, but experienced observation, delivered by someone who had reasons of his own for keeping you informed. She met him at the fence line rather than letting him come to the door. This was deliberate. The door of her cabin was a threshold she was reluctant to let him cross, not for any practical reason, but because something in her had decided, in the days since the letter, that she would control whatever could be controlled. Pruitt was polite. He explained that the Harlan County Coal and Land Company was conducting a survey of Upper Ridge properties, assessing mineral rights that may have been improperly recorded during the chaotic transfer period following the war. He had a list of properties. Her name was on it. He would simply like to review the original deed documentation, if she had it available, and ask a few clarifying questions about the 1922 transaction she would likely recall. Evelyn told him she recalled it clearly. She had purchased a small parcel from a man named Doyle Marsh in early 1920, before his death, and she had the deed properly registered with the county clerk in Harlan. She said all of this with the even steadiness she had spent years constructing, watching his face for the particular flicker that would tell her what he actually knew versus what he suspected. What she saw in his face was more complicated than she had hoped for. He was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, the kind of careful, methodical professional who made his living by noticing small inconsistencies and following them patiently until they opened into larger ones. He wrote in his notebook. He asked about dates. He asked about Marsh's last known associates, framing it as routine background. He mentioned that another man, a surveyor named George Tolliver, who had worked this area in the spring of 1923, seemed to have left the region without completing his contract, and had her seen him at all during that period. The air between them changed on that question. She felt it change, and she believed he felt it change. And for a moment, they were both perfectly aware that they were two people with information the other needed, circling without quite committing to the circle. She told him she had not seen a surveyor in the spring of 1923. She told him this with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes on the middle distance. And she heard the truth and the lie in the statement simultaneously, and marveled, as she sometimes did, at her own capacity to hold both at once. Pruitt thanked her, noted something further in his book, and told her the company might have additional questions. He said this with the same professional pleasantness with which he had said everything else, but the emphasis was slightly different, carrying a particular weight that she recognized as a door being left deliberately open. After he rode back down the logging road, Evelyn stood at the fence line for a long time. The fog was beginning to lift off the lower slopes, and the hollow below her was gradually revealing itself, the creek catching the weak November light in brief, cold flashes. From somewhere deep in the eastern forest, something moved through dry leaves with a sound like whispered conversation. She did not look toward it. She had learned over the years that some sounds were better treated as weather, as events without source or meaning, things that happened to the world, and not because of it. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her cabin and listened to the November wind work its way around the corners of the building. And she thought about Elias Pruitt's notebook, and about the particular way his pen had hesitated before he wrote down her answer about George Tolliver. And she understood, with a clarity that came only in the hours before dawn, that the arrangement with Carver, whatever protection it had provided, was becoming its own form of evidence. The second letter came before the week was out. This one was longer, and its length was itself a change in tone that Evelyn recognized immediately as significant. Carver did not use more words than necessary. When he used more words, it was because the situation required more management, and the situation required more management because it was moving faster than intended. He wrote that Pruitt had continued his inquiries in Loyal, that he had spoken with the county clerk, with 3 different property owners on the lower ridge, and with a deputy sheriff named Weston Cole, who had been quietly looking into the disappearance of George Tolliver since the previous spring. Not officially, not as an investigation, but in the persistent, private way of a man who has a feeling he cannot let go of. Carver wrote that this was more attention than was comfortable, and that he was considering options. Then he told her what the options were. He could arrange for Pruitt's interest to be redirected, through means he did not specify. He could provide documentation that would complicate any examination of the 1920 land transaction. Or, and this was the sentence she read 3 times before she allowed herself to understand it, she could make herself useful in a more immediate way, by providing access to her property for a brief period, during which Carver had certain business to conduct that required a location the county could not easily observe. This was new. In 4 years of their arrangement, he had asked her to be passive, to maintain silence, to deflect questions, to continue existing in her isolation without making trouble. He had never asked her to be actively present for whatever it was he did in the margins of her awareness. The distinction felt to her like the difference between being an accessory to a crime committed in the dark and being asked to hold the lamp. She sat with the letter for an entire day before she made any decision. She walked her property in the cold November air, the frost-stiff grass crackling under her boots, and she looked at the cabin and the smokehouse and the garden and the ridge falling away in every direction into a landscape that had been, for 11 years, the closest thing to safety she had known. She thought about what it had cost to build this safety. She thought about Doyle Marsh, about his hands on her in the kitchen, about the moment before the skillet that she returned to sometimes in dreams and examined for the other choices she might have made. She thought about whether those other choices had actually existed, or whether she was being generous to herself in believing they had. She thought about Carver, about the 9 years of his knowledge of her, about the way he had inserted himself into the worst moment of her life so smoothly that it had taken her nearly a year to understand she had not been rescued, but captured. She thought about the letters she had burned, and about the letters she suspected he had kept, held somewhere she could not reach, an archive of her worst moments, compiled by a man who collected such things the way other men collected land or money, as instruments of permanent leverage. On the second evening, she took out paper and wrote him a reply. She told him she would not allow access to her property. She told him she intended to retain a lawyer in Harlan and address Pruitt's inquiry through legitimate means, which would require her to provide truthful documentation of what she knew about the 1920 transaction. She read this back to herself, and knew as she read it that it was both the right thing to do and possibly the last thing she would do as a free woman. Then she sealed it and carried it to the hollow oak at the bottom of the south field, where she had been leaving her replies for 4 years. And she walked back to the cabin in the November dark without a lamp, navigating by memory and by the feel of the frozen ground under her feet. And she did not allow herself to think about what came next. What came next arrived on a Friday. Not a letter this time. Carver himself, on foot, coming up through the tree line at the back of the property in the early morning dark, when the fog was at its densest and the world beyond the cabin windows was nothing but grey. She heard him on the porch before she saw him, recognized his particular stillness, the way he managed to make his presence felt without making any sound at all. She opened the door before he knocked. This was another ritual, a small insistence on agency, on not being surprised. He stood in the grey morning in a dark coat, his hat wet with fog, looking at her with the expression she had come to know as his working face, composed and interested and entirely without warmth. He said her letter was a mistake. He said it with no particular heat, as if describing a navigational error, something correctable if addressed promptly. He said that a woman in her position did not have the luxury of legitimate means, that legitimate means required a legitimate starting point, and that hers had been forfeit 4 years ago, a fact which he could demonstrate to the satisfaction of any court in the state if she required that demonstration. Evelyn stood in her own doorway and looked at him and felt the full architecture of the past 4 years settle around her like something physical, like the walls of a room that had been gradually, imperceptibly contracting. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him, not loudly, not with any performance of emotion, but with a genuine desire to understand the answer, whether there had ever been any version of the arrangement in which she was intended to come out the other side of it, whether the protection he had offered her in 1920 had ever been anything other than a longer form of ruin. Something moved in his face. It was brief, and she almost missed it. Not guilt, nothing that clean. Something more like professional acknowledgement, the way a craftsman might acknowledge a particularly good question about his process. He told her that her survival had always depended on her usefulness, that this was true for most people, and that she had been more useful than most. She told him to get off her property. She said this in the same quiet voice, and she did not move from the doorway, and she kept her eyes on his face, and she felt, in that moment, something that was either great courage or great stupidity, and could not determine which. He left without argument. He walked back into the fog, and the trees closed behind him, and she was alone on the ridge in the November morning, with the sound of the creek and the distant drip of moisture from the bare branches, and the very clear understanding that she had just done something she could not take back. Deputy Weston Cole had been a lawman in Harlan County for 14 years, long enough to have developed certain instincts that he trusted more than he trusted paperwork, and considerably more than he trusted the accounts of people who had reasons to mislead him. He was 40 years old, a lean, quiet man from Bell County originally, who had come to Harlan for the work, and stayed because leaving had gradually become something he never quite got around to. He was not brilliant, but he was patient, and in his experience, patience accomplished more in the mountains than brilliance ever did. He had begun looking into George Tolliver's disappearance because of a letter Tolliver's wife had sent him in the spring of 1924, almost a full year after Tolliver had left for his survey assignment, and not returned. The letter was restrained, carefully written, not asking for anything dramatic, only for someone to look. She had already contacted the coal company, who had told her that Tolliver had completed his contract and departed for Cincinnati, which she knew to be untrue because he had no reason to go to Cincinnati, and she had a letter from him dated after the supposed completion date, that placed him still in the Upper Ridge country. Cole had started with the coal company's records, which told him very little beyond confirming that the timeline did not match. He had spoken to people in Loyal, in Cumberland, in small settlements along the ridge roads, working in the methodical way he worked, without announcing conclusions, without showing his hand. Just asking questions, and listening, and noting the quality of silence that followed certain specific questions. It was the quality of silence that followed Evelyn Hart's name that had brought him, eventually, to the logging road above Cutter's Creek. He met Elias Pruitt through the coal company, found that their interests briefly overlapped, and they shared enough information over 2 evenings at the hotel in Loyal to understand that they were looking at the same place from different angles. Pruitt was concerned with land fraud and the proper recording of mineral rights. Cole was concerned with a missing man. The address where both concerns converged was a silver-grey cabin on a ridge above a creek that very few people had reason to visit, and fewer reasons to leave. Cole rode up the logging road on a December morning, a week after Pruitt's visit, and 3 days after a source in Loyal had mentioned seeing a man matching the description Cole had been circulating. A compact man in a dark coat, riding toward the upper ridges in the early morning hours of the previous Friday. Evelyn answered the door before he knocked. He noticed this. He noticed also that she was dressed and fully alert at an hour when most people on isolated ridge properties were still managing their morning fires. And he filed both observations away in the practical archive of his instincts, without deciding yet what they meant. He introduced himself and stated his business plainly. He was looking into the disappearance of a man named George Tolliver, surveyor, last known to be working the Upper Ridge country in the spring of 1923. He had reason to believe Tolliver had visited properties in this area. Had she any contact with him? Evelyn looked at Cole for a long moment. The morning fog was heavy at her back, the ridge invisible beyond the tree line, the whole world reduced to this porch and this conversation. She had spent 11 years building a particular kind of answer to questions like this, and she had it ready, smooth and consistent, and plausible. She did not use it. Instead, she told Weston Cole that she had information he needed. She told him that she would give it to him completely and truthfully, on one condition, which was that he listened to all of it before he made any decisions, because the part that concerned her own actions could not be properly understood without the context that preceded it. And she believed, though she acknowledged she could be wrong, that the context changed the meaning of what she had done in ways that the law might or might not recognize, but that a reasonable man would at least be obliged to consider. Cole studied her. He had interviewed a great many people in 14 years, and he had a good sense of when someone was performing and when they were not. He told her he would listen. She told him everything. She told him about Doyle Marsh and the February kitchen. She told him about Carver, about the 9 years of his management, about the letters and the arrangement, and the 2 men who had come to her door in circumstances she could now see had been orchestrated. She told him about George Tolliver, the surveyor, who had arrived in March of 1923, who had been directed to her property by a man in Loyal, who she now believed worked for Carver, and what had happened 3 days after his arrival, when she had found a letter from Carver under the smokehouse stone, telling her that Tolliver had been gathering information that would compromise her, that she needed to ensure he did not deliver his report, and that if she could not manage this herself, Carver would manage it for her, and the debt would be considerably larger. She told Cole what she had done, and what she had not done, and the distinction, she said, was something she could describe but could not prove, and she was aware that this was the difficulty. Cole wrote in his notebook for a long time after she stopped speaking. The fog had lifted slightly, and the ridge had reappeared in the distance, the pale winter sky sitting on the tree line like something cold and judgmental. He asked her where Carver was likely to be found. She gave him everything she knew, which was not enough to find a man who had spent years making himself difficult to find, but was more than Cole had before he climbed the ridge that morning. He told her he would need her to come to Harlan. He said this with the professional decency of a man who understood what he was asking and took no pleasure in it. She nodded and went inside to get her coat and came back out to the porch with the same composure she had worn all morning. And they walked down the logging road together in the December cold, while the mountains watched from every direction and said nothing at all. The trial of Evelyn Hart occupied the Harlan County Courthouse for 9 days in the spring of 1925. It was covered by 3 newspapers, including a Louisville paper whose reporter wrote a series of pieces that were later collected and widely circulated, framing the case as a study in mountain isolation and the moral collapse of a woman abandoned by every institution that might have offered her another way. The reporter was not wrong about the isolation. He was not wrong about the institutions. Whether he was right about the moral collapse was a question the community argued about long after the verdict, and long after Evelyn Hart was gone from among them. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, which was considerable. The property, searched following Evelyn's confession, yielded remains consistent with 2 individuals. One identified as George Tolliver, one never conclusively identified, believed to be consistent with a traveling goods merchant who had last been seen in the Cutters Creek area in the autumn of 1921. Doyle Marsh's death had been officially recorded as an accident in 1920, and the prosecution argued that the circumstances indicated it was not. The chain of events, presented sequentially, was damning in its accumulation. The defense, conducted by a lawyer from Pineville named Ruth Ansley, one of the very few women practicing law in Kentucky at that time, took a different approach. Ansley argued that the evidence, considered in isolation, created a portrait of a murderer. But the evidence was not the whole story. She presented Carver's letters, recovered from a location Evelyn had described and which Cole had located after 3 weeks of searching. There were 22 letters. Their contents, read in court over 2 days, documented with remarkable clarity the mechanism of coercion Carver had constructed over 9 years. They documented also Carver's own extensive involvement in activities he had never been charged with, activities that the prosecutor, a man named Gerald Fitch, was visibly uncomfortable hearing read aloud in his jurisdiction. Carver himself was never found. He had not been found at the time of the trial and would not be found afterward. He was a figure who existed in the evidentiary record as a kind of negative space, defined entirely by the effects of his presence and the traces of his departure. His letters were authenticated by handwriting analysis. The man in Loyal who had directed Tolliver to Evelyn's property, a supply merchant named Frank Aldridge, confirmed under questioning that he had been paid to do so by a man matching Carver's description 2 weeks before Tolliver's arrival on the ridge. This confirmation produced a murmur in the courtroom that took Judge Solomon Price several minutes to settle. Evelyn testified. She sat in the witness box with the same composure she had carried through her entire life, and she answered every question put to her, from both sides, with a precision and honesty that multiple observers later described as extraordinary, and that the Louisville reporter described as the testimony of a woman who had decided that the truth was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. She acknowledged everything that was hers to acknowledge. She described the night with Doyle Marsh without minimizing it, without dramatizing it, with the flat, factual language of someone who had examined the memory so many times that it had become artifact rather than experience. She described her decision not to report it, and she named the fear behind that decision. The knowledge that a woman in her position, with her history, in that county, in that year, reporting the accidental death of a man who had been in her kitchen, uninvited, was not a woman who could expect the machinery of the law to work in her favor. She said this without self-pity, as a statement of circumstance, and looked at the jury when she said it. 12 men who had the grace to receive it without looking away. She described Carver with the precision of 9 years of observation. She described the mechanism of their arrangement, how it had been constructed around her existing fear rather than creating new fear, how he had positioned himself as protection when he was, in fact, the primary danger, how each subsequent event had deepened her obligation and her silence, until both were so absolute that the idea of speaking had seemed not like courage, but like a form of suicide. She said that when she finally did speak, to Cole on the porch in the December fog, she had not expected any particular outcome, but she had been unable to continue the alternative, which was to remain in the arrangement indefinitely, while Carver's demands expanded and her own agency contracted to nothing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on all substantive counts. The courtroom received it in near silence, the kind of silence that is not the absence of response, but the presence of too many responses occurring simultaneously. Judge Price sentenced Evelyn Hart to life imprisonment. He said in his sentencing remarks that he had considered the evidence of coercion presented by the defense, and that he did not dismiss it. He said that the law as written provided him limited latitude in cases where the physical acts themselves were not in dispute. He said the word coercion in a tone that suggested he understood its weight and felt its inadequacy in the present circumstance. Ruth Ansley immediately filed notice of appeal. The appeal would be denied 8 months later by a panel that cited the established legal standard and declined to create new precedent. Evelyn Hart was transported to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in the summer of 1925. She was 43 years old. The mountain cabin above Cutter's Creek was taken by the county for unpaid debts assessed against the estate and subsequently purchased by a coal company that stripped the upper slope of its timber over the following 2 years. Western Coal continued to look for Carver for the remainder of his tenure as deputy sheriff, which ended in 1931. He did not find him. In his personal notes, found after his death by his daughter and preserved in the Bell County Historical Society archives, he wrote that he believed Evelyn Hart to be one of the most comprehensively failed people he had encountered in a career defined by encountering people the world had failed. He wrote that he did not know what justice looked like in a case like hers, and that he had stopped believing the verdict had provided it, though he had not been in a position to prevent it. He wrote that the man who deserved the prison had never spent a single night in one. Evelyn Hart died in the Kentucky State Penitentiary in March of 1941. She was 59 years old. She was buried in the prison cemetery, without a marker, in ground that sits today at the edge of a parking lot, beneath the shadow of a building whose purpose has been changed several times over the intervening decades, as if history itself were practicing the art of covering what it would prefer not to examine. The mountains of eastern Kentucky remember nothing. They hold their fog and their timber and their coal seams and their particular silence. And they receive each generation's stories the way they receive weather, without judgment and without release. The logging road above Cutter's Creek has long since been reclaimed by the forest. If you walked it today, you would find no evidence that a woman lived there once, that she grew collards against the south wall of a silver-grey cabin, that she burned letters in an ashtray on the mantel, or that she stood in her own doorway one November morning and told a man she was done, knowing exactly what it would cost her, and doing it anyway. Before we go, tell us in the comments what you think about Evelyn Hart. Was she a killer who used her circumstances as a shield? Or was she a woman who never had a real choice from the moment Carver appeared at her door? We read every comment, and this is exactly the kind of story where your perspective matters, because reasonable people who have heard the same facts have been disagreeing about the answer for 100 years. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who thinks carefully about the things that are harder to answer than they first appear.
And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the time, because the stories we tell on this channel are always the ones history filed away quietly and hoped no one would think to open again. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. The mountains have more to say, and we intend to keep listening.